A reading from Deuteronomy 30. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I have commanded you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he has scattered you. Even if you've been banished to the most distant lands under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belongs to you and your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul, and live. The Lord your God will put all these curses on your enemies who hate and persecute you. You will again obey the Lord and follow his commands I am giving you today. Then the Lord your God will make you the most prosperous in all the work of your hands and in the fruit of your womb, the young of your livestock and the crops of your land. The Lord will again delight in you and make you prosperous, just as he delighted in your ancestors, if you obey the Lord your God and keep his commandments and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Now, what I'm commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach.
Good morning again. As most of you know, we've been a little bit focused over the last several weeks on new beginnings. We're going to be focused on them in a minute, perhaps. There we go. And, you know, our new beginnings this year started early in the summer, when Vanessa and I made the decision that we were going to put in a small patio in our house, or out beside our house. And we worked the entire summer for it. We dug it out, we put the paver base in, we put the sand in, we leveled it. I did a lot of thinking about it. Vanessa did a lot of the work. We got the pavers in, and then this last week we went and we got a fountain that you see up here. And we were so excited about this patio that we decided we needed to invite some people over to see it. So we called our parents and we said, hey, would you guys come on in? We'd love to show you, this new patio that we put in. And they said that would be great. We called our surrogate son and daughter-in-law from California and invited them in. Even though she's 7 months pregnant, she said, I would not miss that. What an event to come and see that patio that you've put in. And we got our other sons in here. So last night we had this party to unveil our patio and to unveil the fountain. And lo and behold, probably because it was such an inspiring spot, a wedding took place. Who knew? Right? But Bob and Mary Fiedek and Vanessa and I are very proud this morning to introduce to you Mr. and Mrs. David Pagankoff. You guys would stand. Yeah, there's something interesting about new beginnings, whether it is a patio or whether it is a marriage. And that is we fall into some traps when it comes to new beginnings. There are fallacies associated with them. And the first one of those fallacies is that we tend to put the primary focus on the event itself. We spend hours, weeks, months preparing for the event of the new beginning. But the second fallacy is the most difficult one, because not only do we spend all of our time thinking about the event, but we tend to believe that all the hard work is done once the event is over. That at this point we can just sit back and coast. And the fact is, whether it's a patio that has a fountain, that has a pump that has to be cleaned out, and it has to be taken down in the winter and winterized so that the concrete doesn't crack, or whether it's a marriage that has to be nurtured and grown, the hard work doesn't start until after the event is over. And so when I think about new beginnings, I tend to think about the children of Israel and the beginnings that they went through as they were leaving the land of Egypt. And there was a progression in their thinking and in the actions that took place. You might remember from your Bible stories that the children of Israel were in Egyptian captivity for 430 years. Now think about that. Our country is roughly 290 years old. Another 140 years, no, I'm wrong. We're 240 years old. And it'd be 190 years that we would have to go longer to just be a country as long as the children of Israel were in captivity. It's a mind-boggling length of time. And it's no surprise that they were sick and tired of being slaves. They wanted out. They wanted out at virtually any cost. They were in a place they didn't want to be in, doing things they did not want to do. They had a very clear vision of where they wanted to go. They wanted to go to the Promised Land, a land that had been described to them by God, a land that was flowing with milk and honey, that was overflowing with crops and livestock, that would be the perfect haven. They knew exactly where they wanted to go. And God sent them a deliverer, Moses. And we know the story about how he went through the process of getting Pharaoh to change his heart and to allow them to leave. And when they walked out the doors of the country of Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, they were certain they were going to see that Promised Land. But unfortunately, they had an unexpected and unwelcome chain of events take place, because they were forced to detour. See, the vision that they had of what that Promised Land was going to look like and when they were going to get there was very different from the vision that God had. See, God was in the business of preparing a land for them and also preparing them for the land. And that meant a detour and a delay needed to take place. And they were diverted to the wilderness. It had none of the flowing milk and honey. It had none of the livestock. It had none of the benefits that they thought they were going to get. And they were out there for 40 years. And during the midst of that delay, a number of things start to happen. There is confusion. We thought we were being delivered. What's going on? There was conflict. Well, if we're not going where we thought we were going, leadership must be to blame. It always is. And there was consternation. Who's going to fix this? How's it going to get fixed? Who's going to take charge and change the circumstances that we find ourselves in today? But the fact was, there were lessons that needed to be learned by the children of Israel as God was preparing them for the land. The first of those was that they needed to learn to trust. See, they thought their fate was in their own hands. They thought they controlled their destiny. But what they learned was they had no control whatsoever. And they were totally reliant on God's timing and God's will. Secondly, they learned that they were going to have to change. That during those 40 years, they had to go from being slaves to becoming soldiers. They had to go from being the conquered to being able to become the conquerors. And that required a transformation in them that they neither asked for nor were prepared for. And at the end of it, because of that transformation and because of that growing trust in God, they came to a clearer sense of identity and purpose. Before, they saw themselves merely as captives, wishing they could get out of the circumstance that they were in. And now they began to see themselves truly as the chosen children of God, with a destiny to take a land that He was preparing for them. And finally, they had to learn to obey. I mean, that goes right along with trust, but it is the most difficult part. Because when they didn't obey, there was a consequence. God delayed them even further from getting into the land. All of the people that left the land of Israel, the land of Egypt, that were adults, didn't get to go into the promised land because they failed to obey. And so they had to learn that there is a reward for obedience. You get the land. And there is a consequence for disobedience. You don't get the land. And so in the course of learning those lessons, they finally come to the point where they arrive. It is the new beginning. And they fall into the trap. Their primary focus was on the event. And they believed that the hard work was already done. That from this point on, they would get to coast. And so they get to the very verge of the promised land. And as they're standing on the opposite side of the Jordan River, and Moses is saying the last words that are going to be said to them by him, he conveys to them 3 conditional promises from God. It was in the reading that Andre just read to us. The first of those conditional promises was this: when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey Him with all your heart and all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all of the nations where He scattered you. The second conditional promise was a little bit different, but similar. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the hearts of your descendants so that you may love Him with all your heart, with all your soul, and then live. And the third promise, very similar. The Lord will again delight in you and make you prosperous, just as He delighted in your fathers, if you obey the Lord your God, keep His commands and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. There are 4 requirements of the children of Israel in these conditional promises. They have to return, they have to obey, they have to love, and they have to turn to God. And in consideration of that, or along with that, they have to do it in a certain way. In every one of those situations, they are asked to do it with all of their heart and with all of their soul. There is no part way. There's no 1 foot in, 1 foot out. There's no watching everybody else because we already did the hard work while we were in the wilderness. It is all your heart and all your soul. What God required of the children of Israel was you have to be all in. When you cross that river, you are not ending a journey. You are beginning a journey. And when that happens, these 3 things will happen. Number 1, He will restore your fortunes. Number 2, He will circumcise your hearts. And number 3, He will delight in you and make you prosperous. Now, you know, the first one and the third one sound pretty good, but that circumcise your heart thing doesn't sound so good. So what's going to happen? God is going to transform them. He is going to change them. He's going to make a covenant with them if they are all in with Him. There is a reward for making that commitment. And you will become a person who is physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially aligned to the will of God. And He says in verse 11, and it's not too difficult for you. It is not beyond your reach. Now, when I was reading through this, I could not help but think of the journey that we have been on over the last 2 years. You know, it began almost exactly 2 years ago. In fact, I think it might have been on this second Sunday of August, 2 years ago, that Daniel Fletcher came to the elders and said, hey, I've made a career decision. You know, I've been working for a long time to get my doctorate degree. You know, I have always told you that I intended to be a professor, and I'm going to go full-time into academia. So I'm going to be resigning my position. Well, we were in a place we did not want to be, doing something we did not want to do, when we had to replace Daniel as our minister. I only wish he was here so he could enjoy that. And we thought at the time that we had a clear vision of the promised land. We didn't ask for much. We wanted a guy who was old enough to be very mature and could counsel us all, but not too old. We didn't want him to have kids that were over, you know, maybe 12, 13, 14 years old. We wanted a guy who had all of the knowledge that Daniel had, but hadn't spent his life in academia. We wanted a guy who had a wife who was going to be the perfect minister's wife, who would visit every single day, who would teach ladies' Bible class, who would host everything at her home. We wanted them to have perfect kids that would always be role models for our kids. And we wanted him to work for $40,000 a year. Wasn't a lot to ask. And that clear vision was what we pursued. We put together a search committee and we went after it. Andrew, we had the perfect job description. Right? That guy would have had trouble fitting it. Right? But we went after it. And we thought for sure we were going to get a minister 3, 4, 5 months. But an unexpected detour occurred. It was an 18-month search. And during the course of that time, we had 6 very active families here relocate. Most of them went to heaven, to Texas. Others went to other places in the U.S. But we lost 6 families. And we lost 2 very important members to death. Very long and painful illnesses. And in the course of that detour, we went through exactly what the children of Israel went through. Confusion, some conflict, a lot of consternation. This is not the way this was supposed to work out. What's wrong here? Who's responsible? How's this going to get fixed? And at the end of the day, there were some lessons that we needed to learn, just like the children of Israel. Unfortunately, we had to learn to trust. Because what we didn't really understand at the time, I mean, intellectually we might have said the words, but God was busy not only preparing a man for us, but He was also preparing us for a man. And in the course of that period of time, we had to change. Because we're like virtually every church in the world We rely on the preacher. I mean, we pay him. He's supposed to do the stuff, right? So when a sermon's going to be done, he's going to do it. When office hours are going to be there, he's going to do it. When we need something led, he's going to be the guy that's here. And darn it, he better do it well because we're paying him. But the problem is, when you don't have a preacher, who's going to do it? And we came to a very painful realization. The realization was it had to be us. And in the course of learning that, we started to develop a new sense of identity and purpose in this congregation. We did not ask for it. We would not have chosen it. Given the vote right now, we probably wouldn't want to go through it again. But something happened that started to change in this congregation. In the course of the 18-month search, we had 14 different men in this congregation who got up and preached sermons. Half of those had never done it before. And I thought they did great. They discovered that there was something in them that they had never expressed, that given necessity, it came out. We put on the first VBS that this congregation has put on in well over 10 years. It might have been close to 15 as we did it. There was no preacher. There was no full-time staff here. And we had a great VBS last summer. I never saw so many families and adults involved in putting on a VBS. You know why we did it? Because we didn't have a choice. And people started to recognize we have capability. We have capacity. God has imbued us with something that we can use. And during the course of that, oh, by the way, we did 4 mission trips at the same time. And we learned a very important lesson. And that lesson was that our power is not in a person, a preacher. It is in our collective purpose as the people of God. But you see, we're now at the arrival of a new beginning. That guy doesn't look a lot like our vision, but he has some interesting qualities that we never saw coming. We didn't think we would pick a guy who had never been a preacher before in his life. We didn't think we'd pick a guy who had been running a Christian school. But when we started talking to him and we realized, what is it that we need? We need somebody who can mobilize resources, who's used to leading volunteers, who knows how to get into the community, who is eager to go out and meet people and bring them in. Realize he had all of the perfect things that we needed. And I can tell you that 18 months ago, we wouldn't have given him a look. Would not have given him a look. But God changed us to prepare us for him. Interestingly enough, 18 months ago, he wouldn't have given us a look because he wasn't ready to get out of his role. And during the course of that period of time, he began to feel a calling to go into church ministry. And he prayed about it. He talked to his dad about it, who's been a minister all of his life. He talked to a number of people about it. And he came to the conclusion that he needed to make a transformational life change. He didn't want to uproot his family, but he wanted to make a leap of faith. We needed him, and he needed us. Next Sunday, Paul Fisher starts here. But you know, the trap that we can fall into is that the primary focus will be, well, we finally got our preacher. Whoa, boy. That was tough. Thank heavens that's over. The hard work is done. Now we can coast. By the way, we're paying that guy. I'd tell you, we didn't get him for $40,000. He needs to be doing everything, right? Because that's what preachers are supposed to do. But But we need to remember, just as the children of Israel needed to remember, the lesson that we learned. Our power is not in a person, a preacher. It is in our collective purpose as the children of God. The work is not ending. The work is just beginning. Paul's going to come in next week, and he's got lots of ideas. He sat down with Daniel and I. I'm going to figure out this Paul thing pretty quick. Sat down with Paul, Daniel, and I about 3 weeks ago. We were meeting on Sunday morning. He walked over, knocked on the door about 10 till 9. He said, "Hey, can I talk to you guys?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "I've got an assignment for you." Whoa, this guy's getting off, quick. And he says, "I want you to put together a list for me, prioritized, of the people that I need to be visiting first." We had to pick ourselves off the floor. We've been here 15 years. Neither one of us had ever heard that question. And we're like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what we need. But you see, Paul's job is not to be the only guy that visits the people who need to be visited. Paul's job is to be one guy. And he said, I'm going to take people with me. And I'm going to ask people to be mobilized and to get involved. Because what he recognizes is a school doesn't run off of just a principal. And a church doesn't run off of just a preacher. We all have a responsibility. And so our job is to return to that understanding that God has prepared us for this new beginning. To love, to turn to God, and to mobilize ourselves. And he asks us the same thing that he asked the children of Israel. All your heart, all your soul, all in. And God's promises never fail, and they don't change. God prospers those who work for him. God circumcises the hearts of those who turn to him. And God delights in those. You want to see these pews filled again? It's not because Paul's going to get up here every single week and preach the best sermon that was ever preached, and people are going to magically walk in. It's going to be because of us doing what we need to do along with him to build this church back. And God has promised us that it is not too difficult or beyond our reach. And so our focus as a congregation for this next year is on reach. We are changing our ministry structure because of this change in staffing that we're having. And we have 3 elements of reach that you're going to start hearing about. Reaching out, local and abroad, reaching in for the care and feeding of our membership, and reaching up as we try to grow and we try to become closer to God. And so we were very clear as we started this surge about the direction for the future. We want to outreach in this community. We have a tremendous spread, 40 miles each way, of people that drive into this church. And that is not a sustainable model for a church. And we're seeing the fruits of that. We need to build a community in King of Prussia that will be foundational to the future of this congregation. And as we do that, we want to set the stage for planting churches in some of the communities where some of us live 30, 40 miles away from now. But that's down the road. That's 5 years out, if we do everything right. Today, we want to build this community. Paul's mission and our mission is to build this community. And so our needs are a full-time, dedicated effort. That's what we've hired Paul. But it is an all-in involvement from us. A missionary mindset. Most of us don't live here in King of Prussia. But this is our community that we need to build in Norristown, and Phoenixville, and Audubon, and to build a hub that makes us a strong, ongoing congregation. And so our new structure is mobilized around this. We are setting up 4 pods of leadership. The first one, I don't know if you can even read it. Can you read that? Barely? I'm going to try to tell you what it says. The first one is the Reaching Out group. This group is going to be led by Jason Pearl, not surprisingly, because Jason leads our mission efforts here. And we've got 5 areas that are going to be important in here. We have something we're calling events. And the events is things like financial peace, things like VBS, things that will bring people from the community here as an event takes place. And Brian's already heading up our financial peace efforts and has done a great job with that over the last couple of years. Dawn has headed up our VBS. They're going to be responsible for this area. In missions, we're going to ask Kim and Jason to continue to lead the Haiti and the Honduras efforts. Jason has taken over our benevolence work. Benevolence could be in, it could be out. We're looking at it as an opportunity for outreach, and we've put it there. And then we've got Paul and Dave Stevens in local outreach. Dave has led, sometimes almost solo, our efforts in Coatesville around good works. We're going to try to expand those kinds of efforts closer here to the congregation and get more people involved in those things. And of course, Paul will be focused on that 5 days a week. And then Dawn will continue to work in counseling. All of those groups are going to need people to help. Those are just the leaders of those groups. We need people to volunteer and to be part of that. The second group is going to be the Reaching In group. And Mark Cristaldi is going to lead this. As you all know, Mark, I think most of you know, Mark is on the board now at Camp Manatani, as are 2 or 3 others in our congregation. And Mita is very active. Obviously, we've got a lot of kids out there this week. And so we're asking Mita to lead the Camp Manatani work, especially since Steve Kasha is no longer with us and led that for a number of years. Men's and women's ministries, we're still going to have Rebecca heading up on the women's side, and we're asking Warren Jordan to head up on the men's side and to revitalize some of the things around manly morning and some other activities. Small groups, Paul Fisher is going to be working with that, but we've asked Elizabeth. The Pats have hosted and been active participants in small groups like forever. It's amazing since you're as young as you are. But Elizabeth is going to be working hand in hand with Paul as we put together small groups, starting just in the next few weeks. Fellowship, the Murrays are very active in this. We were beneficiaries of that last night, by the way, and we appreciate that so much. So Jeff and Megan will be leading in that area. And then Simple Supper, Aaron and Ann have been very active in cooking with that, and we're going to ask them to coordinate the Simple Supper activities going forward. All of that's under Reaching In. Then in Reaching Up, this is our corporate experience of worship and education. So Paul is going to be responsible for worship. Andrew's leading this whole group. Andrew is going to be responsible for the coordination of all of this. Paul, because of his new role, will be active working with Andrew in worship. And then in children's education, the folks that have done such a great job over the last couple of years, Dawn and Mita and LaDonna are all going to continue to be responsible for that. Paul will take over adult education. Those of you who are sick of me teaching will be very happy of that. And then in youth, Josh and Allison will continue their work there. Then we have a group that we didn't really know how to put the reaching. You know, Dan Culp said maybe it's reaching around. But this is the operational stuff. And while it's one of those things that's not real fun to talk about, it is critically important in a church. Dan already serves as the treasurer of the church, and so Dan is going to lead this group. And under that heading, we have the building, which Greg and Jeff are already working in. We have finance, which Dan and Joe are very active in. We have technology that Greg and Dave and Bob, I should have put you on here because Bob, you work in that area as well. And then worship scheduling, we have Warren and we have Jeff in there. Critically important area. We have a building that's 22 years old. We have air conditioners that are starting to go this summer. And we're starting to spend money that we knew was on the horizon. And so Dan is doing a great job working with these folks in trying to plan appropriately so that we can transition some of that. So in the midst of all that, we're going to have a group that's focused around communication with a new preacher who, by the way, is pretty active on social media. You can go out to Paul's Facebook page. He tweets quite a bit. He's active out in that space. And Mark has redesigned our web page so that Paul can get in there and very frequently update the church web page, make it a little more sticky, something that people will want to get to. And then Mark will continue to head up communications. And so the structural rationale is by grouping these ministry leaders into focused teams, we think we can get synergy in them working together in these areas. Secondly, we have leadership of those teams by individuals who have been active already in those areas. And as Paul comes in, you can see he's plugged in to each of those areas with those leaders. And that's important for one very important reason, which is the last bullet point. Neither Paul Daniel or I are getting any younger. Our time will be coming to an end in this role, and we have a responsibility for succession planning in this congregation. And so the 4 men that we have put in these 4 areas of responsibility are men who are candidates down the road, some sooner, some later, to be elders in this congregation. And we wanted to elevate their leadership responsibilities to prepare them for those responsibilities down the road. So last of all, what we need is everyone all in. There's a story told of a father who loved his children tremendously, but they didn't love him. One after another left their father's house, and they vowed never to come back. But finally, the father had a son who reciprocated that love. The son honored, he respected, he obeyed his father. The father was thrilled, but he was still mourning over those other children who had rejected him. So he came up with a plan. And it was a risky plan. He said, I'll give up my beloved son to make room in my house for my wayward children to return. And hopefully, they'll realize that my love for them was true, and they'll come back home. You might recognize the vignette as the most important story ever told. For God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish, but have eternal life. We have a God who went all in for us. And He asks that we go all in for Him. Next week is a new beginning in this congregation. Let's make it a great one. Let's stand and sing.